Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ann. I'm the lead animal care specialist for large carnivores here at Brookfield Zoo. Unfortunately, with all the rain we've had lately, our bear moats are full of water, and so we're unable to put the bears on exhibit right now. We're working hard to pump the water out, but until then I thought today we could talk about some bear artifacts. This is Bear Awareness Week. We're celebrating all 8 bear species throughout the week, although we're highlighting the 3 bear species we have at the zoo, which is sloth bears, brown bears, and polar bears. So we're here at Great Bear Wilderness where we house our 4 brown bear and polar bears. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about each of the artifacts that we have, and then I can answer any questions that you have. And so it's actually cool is that polar bears evolved from brown bears. And so we're going to start a little bit with brown bears. And so we have a skull here of a Kodiak bear. So brown bears are actually found throughout the western half of the United States. And there's kind of 2 subsets of brown bears based on where you find them in the wild. So you have what's called like a mainland grizzly, which would live throughout the contiguous United States. And they're actually a smaller brown bear. They'd be found in like Montana, Utah, Wyoming, things like that. And they're leaner and a smaller size. But then you have the island brown bears, which is what we have here. Jim and Axie are our Alaskan coastal brown bears that were born on Admiralty Island. And this is actually a skull from a Kodiak bear. So a Kodiak brown bear is actually the largest bear ever recorded. Not this particular brown bear, but brown bears in general. Usually polar bears are taller and larger, but they're actually the largest recorded bear is actually a Kodiak. And the reason the island bears are so large, like Jimmy and Axie compared to a mainland, is that the size of a bear as an adult is proportionate to the amount of protein they have in their diet as a cub. So Admiralty Island and Kodiak Island have a very huge fish population, and so they have a very large lean protein component of their diet as they're growing up, and so that actually makes their body size larger as adults. And so some cool things about this skull you can actually see is they have a very wide head. And you can see they have very large areas for their eyes and the eye areas here. They are a predator, and so they do actually look forward instead of out to the side like a prey species. So their eye sockets are actually looking forward, but they have a very large, wide head. We get a lot of great questions on these Facebook Lives, and one of them includes teeth. So I can show you teeth on here. This is actually a bear that lived here at Brookfield Zoo to a very old age. So they do have some issues with dental that you normally would see after 20 to 30 years of chewing on bones and different things like that. But I've got asked before, how many teeth do a bear have? And they actually, brown bears and polar bears have 42 teeth. We're not going to count all 42, but you can see they have this cool indentation right here, and that's actually so they can hold on to the prey species that they get a hold of to kill so that they can eat them. And then these little tiny teeth in the front are for them to pick all the hair and the different small pieces of meat off. So each tooth actually has a specific adaptation. Obviously these big canines are used to secure their prey animals. And so they actually are designed to hunt. Like I said, the island bears eat a lot of fish, and they need to be able to catch them. They actually, a cool thing about bear hunting is brown bears actually use their claws more than their teeth. And so if you were to come to the zoo and look at Jimmy and Axie eating versus Hudson eating, you would actually see that they do a lot of cool things, like they roll the food on top of their paw and then they bring it to their mouth. They tear things up with their claws more than crunching with their teeth. And so that's a really cool adaptation that brown bears have, because in the wild they live in a streamed habitat. So they have a lot of streams and lakes and things, and so they need to be able to spear fish or trap them on the ground or against the side of the stream, and so they need those claws to hold that in, as opposed to a polar bear that is so cool about diving in and grabbing animals. Or they wait at air holes and they wait for the seals to come up and take a breath, and they use their teeth to then haul them out onto the ice, because bears in general are not very graceful in the water. They're much more adept to moving around on land, but they have prey species that live in the water, and so they need to be able to adapt to that to be successful hunters. Because they weigh up to 1,200 pounds, the males do, that's a lot of food they need to consume. It changes seasonally throughout the year, about 200 pounds one way or the other, but they need to be very adept hunters to survive. And so that's a cool species trait that they have in the ways that they eat differently based off their natural habitat. Actually, later today on Instagram, you'll hear our nutritionist speaking about how we feed them here at the zoo, which is a little different than how they eat in the wild, but we try and mimic pretty closely. So here's actually, we're going to move on and show you, I talked a little bit about how they use their feet for eating and walking. And so this is actually a paw cast from a Kodiak bear, the brother of this bear from the skull. And you can see they have this large foot padded to move around. And then they have individual claws. They have 5 claws on their rear feet. And so they actually use these claws, like I said, to spear fish and push them up against the side. But they also eat a lot of root vegetables and a lot of fruits. They're very good berry pickers. They like a lot of sweet things. I'm sure you all heard that bears love honey, and they need to get up to those honeybees into their nests, and so they can use these claws to knock them down. They are very good at climbing trees. Kodiaks and brown bear adult males are not as good at climbing trees because they are so heavy, especially in their rear end. It makes tree climbing difficult for very high up, and so when they're younger, or some females climb trees a little bit better than these big males get as they become adults. Because you can see how large that foot is. It doesn't wrap as adeptly around a tree limb like you would see a lot of the black bears. A lot of bears you see up in trees are smaller black bears because they're not quite as heavy. But you can see it's a narrower foot and a longer foot as opposed to a polar bear paw cast that we're going to see next, which is actually a very wide and circular one and much larger. This is quite big compared to my hand. I'm trying to give you something to compare to. Whereas a polar bear back foot is actually the size of a 12-inch dinner plate or bigger. They have much larger feet, which we'll talk about next. And then the way that they're shaped, an actually cool way for us to track polar bears, or brown bears, I'm sorry, in the wild is actually to use a radio collar with a GPS. So this is actually a GPS collar that was on a wild brown bear, and this has a GPS tracking system in it, and so actually they can then see all the migratory ways that bears are moving around, and we can learn what kind of habitats they like. Do they go to the same place every year? Do females like to keep their young and their dens in the same location, or do they move it around quite a bit, and how does that relate to other bears in the wild that are near them? Obviously females stay farther away from males, especially when they have cubs. They go into hiding for about a year or so until the cubs are weaned at between a year and a half to 2 years. But this actually will go on the neck and stay on there pretty well because of the way the head is shaped. It won't fall off. Whereas a polar bear tracking collar is a little bit different because their head is so lean and slim that it's easier to get a collar off. So actually when we do tracking with bears, polar bears, they're starting to learn to do things on necks and actually legs and things like that to keep the collars or equipment attached. And so this is a little bit about island brown bears. And then this is actually some brown bear fur from here at the zoo. So bears actually do shed. They shed out their winter coat in the spring. And so this is, it's kind of a coarse material. It feels a little bit like wool from like an alpaca or a llama, if you've ever felt that. You can see there's a lot of debris in here because they like to build nests and they like to play around and they roll around in the dirt and they dig up a lot of stuff. And so when they swim, it actually pulls a lot of this fur off, and we actually have a really cool filtration system here at the zoo that skims the top of our pools and pulls this off, and so we actually have a lot of this that comes out of our pool filtration system to keep it clean. But that's a brown bear fur, which is a little different if you come next to me. This is actually a polar bear pelt, and so while this is just what shedded off the top of a brown bear, this is actually the pelt from a polar bear. And so it actually has all the layers. So polar bears have multiple layers of fur. So this top layer, all the fur is clear and hollow, and it looks white from the way it refracts the light. But then if you get down deeper, you actually have a second underlayer here that's actually even softer. And then their skin is actually gray and dark black underneath, and that helps them absorb the sunlight in the winter as an insulation. So they have their dark skin to absorb sunlight, and then they have this under layer to keep them really warm, and then they have this outer layer that's waterproof that helps them remove water after they dive. And so they can shake that off or dry it off by rolling around. And then they shed a lot of this out in the summer to keep cooler. They can tolerate some heat, although they do overheat pretty easily. We have a cool air conditioning system here, and the bears get their own ice machines, and we actually have chilled pools as well to keep them cool in the summertime. So they do shed out some of this, but it keeps them with these 2 layers. This is a really good view of it. You can see they have a nice insulation system. They can be out to negative 55 degrees in the wild. We don't do that here, obviously, although Chicago is a great example of weather that they do well in the winter. They can be out till about negative 22 degrees here, and with the choice to come in and out of the building as they choose here at the zoo. And then if it gets colder than that, we do choose to lock them inside sometimes, but that's more for the building needs than the polar bear needs. And so this is their fur, and then next is this pawcast, and it might be a little bit different to see. So this brown bear one is actually the reverse, so it comes out, but this one actually dents in. So this is, we have the polar bear actually can step in a cast like this to make it. So you can also see 5 claws, and actually I actually have a polar bear claw that fits in here, so you can see it actually is curved and points down. And so we have this claw, so you can actually see what a polar bear looks like. Another cool thing about polar bears that brown bears don't have, that it's hard to see on this, is they actually have webbing between each of their toes. So it helps create like a paddle system that you would see like a sea otter or other marine mammals have. Polar bears are marine mammals. They're incredibly intelligent, and they live in the water a great deal of their time. They can swim for miles and miles. And so they're very adept at being in the water. Even if they're not as graceful as seals, they can do well, especially as they need to locomote and move around and migrate to follow the fish source on the sea ice in the winter to try and get food. And so they have a very furry bottom foot. All these indentations are actually fur. And so they actually have a fur coating all around here. And then it's hard to see, but they actually have papillae. So little tiny things that are kind of like if you have your cat's tongue and it has all those little pointy spots that helps them groom themselves and eat really well. Polar bears have that on their paw pad so that they can stick to the ice when they're walking so they don't slip and slide all around. So it's a really cool adaptation they have for living on the ice most of their year, trying to hunt and move around with those seals. So that's cool. So this is about 12 inches diameter across. So this is a quite large one. If you ever came to the zoo and met Aussie, our Hudson's dad, he had the biggest back paws I've ever seen. They were quite large, almost 16 inches. And so these are really big for males. And then we'll go to this polar bear skull, and you can actually see they actually also have a bit of a wide area, but they're a much longer and leaner head, and that's actually so they can dive really well, and they're pretty aerodynamic for diving, but they're much longer, and their head is a much leaner, longer, more like a triangle, as opposed to a brown bear head's kind of like a square. And again, we can see teeth. This has a little bit better teeth structure than the brown bear skull that we have, in that it's got longer, pointier teeth. You can see it's actually a much leaner base teeth right here too, as well as here. But they have the same thing. They have the canines and they have the tiny teeth, and they have that dent right here that helps them to hold on really well. Some cool adaptations that a lot of predators have, especially like tigers, is that a lot of times their bottom jaw actually only moves up and down. It doesn't move side to side like some animals, and that's actually so that they have the most tensile strength to hold that prey once they've captured it. And so it's a cool adaptation to make it the strongest jaw possible. So if it only moves up and down instead of side to side, you can hold on much stronger, which is pretty cool. And so the bears that we have here at Great Bear Wilderness, like I mentioned, we have Jim and Axie, which are our 25-year-old Alaskan coastal brown bears that were born on Admiralty Island. So they're island bears. They're much larger, much wider than you would see a small mainland grizzly that's only 600 to 700 pounds. Island bears can get up to 1,200 pounds. Our bears here are only up to around 900 pounds right now because they're 25 years old. And so most bears in the wild live 15 to 18 years on average. But in zoos, in professionally managed care, we can almost double that to mid to late 30s. But because bears are built to be 15 to 18 years, as they get older, they have the same issues that adults have as they get older. And so we actually keep them a little bit leaner here so they don't have as much arthritis and weight on their joints that they would have if we let them get as large as they were when they were younger. They also have a little less muscle tone, just as humans do as they age. And so they don't need to be as heavy, because muscle weighs more than fat, and so if they're losing a little bit of muscle tone, they can be skinnier. So you can see we have a little bit of, our bears are a little leaner these days, and that's to keep them as healthy as possible. We also do not technically hibernate our bears here, and so we don't need them to get as heavy either, because they don't go into that deep sleep that some brown bears do in the wild if they're in colder habitats. So if a bear is in a really, really cold habitat in the wild, they'll actually hibernate for several months, especially December, January, and February, where food sources are quite scarce. But here at Brookfield Zoo, while we do have cold temperatures and they have their very own hibernation den, if you've ever been here to see our exhibit with a hibernation den, you can see from underwater viewing, they go into what's called a torpor, which is what a bear would go into when it's in a warmer habitat or there's food sources readily available. It's called torpor. They're very, very sleepy. They sleep about 23 hours a day, 22 hours a day, but they don't stay sleeping. They come inside each day, they check things out, they eat a little bit of dog chow, and they go back to sleep. We just have a very busy habitat here at the zoo. They can hear us managing the polar bears, they can smell the polar bear food, and they're very curious. And so they don't do a full hibernation, but they do get quite sleepy, and this time they're technically emerging from that. So they came out and they woke up April 1st, and they're roaming around, and they're starting to gain weight, and they're getting more diet items right now. Right now they're getting around 4,000 to 6,000 calories a day to start putting on their weight. So starting in around June or July, they'll start to pack on a little more weight, and then they'll be at their heaviest at around 13,000 calories mid-August, and then we'll start to taper them down a bit to get ready for that torpor state. So it's a very seasonal diet. It follows the same as you would see in the wild. And so we do give them fish and a lot of protein, but they get tons and tons of produce and chow and different items, and they love bones all the time. And then the same as we do manage polar bears seasonally a bit as well, but not quite as much. And so they do get quite a big increase in their diet before they go into the winter season, but that's more because we've got breeding season in the winter here of the breeding pair, and so we like to keep them satiated. So they do get leaner in the summer when it's hotter, so they can thermoregulate a little bit better, and then we get them a little heavier in the winter so that they can tolerate the winter and they're ready for that like they would be in the wild. They have some produce in their diet, but they get much more fish, meat sources, chow sources, and different things. I'm going to let Jen Watts, our nutritionist, go into some more details about all their different favorite food items and all the different parts of their diet later on today on Instagram. I won't go into full part of that. But one more thing I wanted to talk to you a little bit about was that we actually have a family tree here of Archie and Aussie. So Brookfield Zoo has always been a huge participant in the polar bear SSP and their breeding and transfer plan, and so we collectively breed based on their recommendations. And so several years ago, in the 90s, we actually imported, in the 80s, Aussie was imported out of Australia, which is how he got his name. He was born at the Adelaide Zoo, and he came in 1985. And then Archie was actually born here in 1984, and they were pretty much our power couple for quite some time. And so until recently, they actually had the most offspring of any bear in North America. They have since been surpassed, which is great news for the bears SSP, that we've got other polar bears in the country contributing. And so we thought we'd show you a cool thing about the bears that we've had here at Brookfield Zoo. So Archie and Aussie have had 5 kids. Marty is actually at Toledo Zoo right now. They had Tigawak, Kennepah. Peyton can be found at the Memphis Zoo, and Hudson's still living right here at Brookfield Zoo. He is the youngest polar bear here and the last polar bear born here at Brookfield Zoo. And then Marty is a big champ over here at Toledo, and so he's actually had several cubs. I'm going to point out the first one is, here's Nikita, who's at North Carolina Zoo, and that is actually our female here in Nanuak, Miss Nan we call her. Her cub Nikita was born and has since gone to North Carolina Zoo, where he is paired with a female there. But Marty at Toledo had another female that he got to hang out with named Crystal, and they actually have had all of these cubs. And then actually Aurora, what a champ, has added several great grandkids, and Anana's actually had one as well. And so these are all the cubs that we can trace back to Archie and Aussie here at Brookfield Zoo, and all the cubs that have come through here, which is pretty awesome. So that kind of, we can take some questions now if anybody has any.
I think you answered most of the questions, but I did see one that I thought was pretty interesting. So, prefers to spend more time in the water, Jim or Axie?
So that's a really good question. So here's some fun facts about brown bears. Most brown bears, because their habitat in the wild is streams instead of deep water, they actually don't like to get their ears wet. They're actually designed to hunt from on top of the water and to knock the fish out or spear the fish, and so they generally don't dive. But 1 in 500 brown bears will actually dive down. And here's a cool fact. Jimmy will not get his ears wet, but Axie loves to dive. And so if you ever see a brown bear at the bottom of a pool, that's got to be Axie. He's the only brown bear here that'll dive. Whereas Jimmy actually will walk around on his little tippy toes on the back parts of the exhibit that has a raised platform, and he'll keep his head above water, or he'll swim above water and kind of doggy paddle around to get food. So actually, Jimmy is the more dominant of the brown bear brothers. He's about 20 kilos heavier. And so the way we feed him is that we actually let Axie get to food first and defend it before we let Jimmy. But if we're talking about in the water, if we want to give Axie something that we don't want Jim to steal from him, we actually will just sink it down in the pool, knowing that Axie will dive down and get it for himself.
So how long can they hold their breath?
They don't hold their breath for very long. Polar bears can hold their breath much longer, but it's only about a minute or two. They don't spend a lot of time submerged. They really just go down and get what they want and they resurface immediately. They don't spend a lot of time like seals or other marine mammals down below water.
Who decides when bears are moved to other zoos?
The Species Survival Planning Committee determines it for polar bears. They are managed collectively, and so we participate in that. And so every year or so they get together and they make a plan for where the bears should go to help with keeping the genetics really strong and inbreeding down, and personality profiles and who can handle breeding situations. And so the SSP manages that. Brown bears are actually not managed by an SSP. Brown bears are doing great in the wild, and so we focus a lot of our energy in zoos on breeding endangered species or other animals that need a lot of help in the wild. And brown bears are actually doing pretty great as long as they can get access to each other through corridors and protected land. And so because there are so numerous in the wild, how we manage brown bears in zoos is that we actually bring in bears that can't stay in the wild, whether it's a cub that was orphaned like Jimmy and Axie that needed help in zoos, or if it's a nuisance bear that's gone into human predator conflict and they can't kind of find a solution for that. Sometimes those bears will come into zoos, but we don't have brown bear cubs born at zoos because they can live up to 35 years and they're doing great in the wild, so we save that space for animals that need more time.
Do polar bears hibernate?
They do not hibernate, so they move around quite a bit males move around extensively looking for females during that period of time. They can build an ice shelter and they can kind of shelter up if there's going to be kind of a bad weather patch. And females actually will build an ice den and they'll get down under the ice layer and they'll actually have cubs in there, and then they stay in there for up to 6 months because cubs are only a pound when they're born. So a mom will actually dig down in a den, give birth, and stay there for many, many months nursing their babies until they come back out and emerge. So it's not a hibernation, it's either denning up for having cubs or it might just be a little bit of severe weather sheltering.
And let's do one more. Do they have any predators?
Humans are their only predators, and so there are no predators for polar bears and brown bears other than humans. Or you could consider climate change is also a predator, especially for polar bears. They need their sea ice to hunt. Without their sea ice, they cannot feed themselves. And so those are kind of their main issues right now for both of those species. So that's our last question. I want to thank you so much for joining us here. I know it was unfortunate you weren't able to see bears today, but right after this, we're actually going to post a really cool video that we put together, a compilation of Jimmy and Axie footage that we made for their 20th birthday 5 years ago. You'll get to see them kind of growing up here at the zoo. It's a pretty great video, and I hope you check it out. And I hope when we reopen that we see you here. We miss you all, and we appreciate your support, and we hope you have a great day.